we talk a lot about the future of work. We talk a lot about where things are headed from a reactive perspective. When you talk about it that way, you're resigning and saying, I hope that whoever builds that future, that there's a good place for me and my organization in it. So instead I say, no, we're at a moment in time where we all know there's this inflection point where we need to make some strategic decisions. So what is the future that you want to be in? What future of work do you want to build for yourself and your organization or your department? And then what would have to be true for you to be able to do that?
Hello and welcome to the GeekWire podcast. I am GeekWire co-founder Todd Bishop, and we are coming to you this week from El Gaucho restaurant in Bellevue, Washington. This is GeekWire's Agents of Transformation series. We're hosting it in partnership with Accenture, and I'm very pleased to welcome here for this dinner audience of Accenture and Microsoft executives, Brian Evergreen. Brian, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Brian Evergreen is a strategist, author, and technology executive who spent his career at the intersection of AI and organizational leadership, including stints at Accenture and AWS and Microsoft. I want to talk about your experiences at those companies later on, Brian. At Microsoft, you served as US AI strategy lead and later ran autonomous AI co-innovation in Microsoft Research. He wrote the book Autonomous Transformation, Creating a More Human Future in the Era of AI, which will form the basis for much of our conversation tonight. And the thing that makes his perspective in the book especially interesting right now is that you actually wrote this before ChatGPT launched. You were making the case for rethinking how organizations approach AI before the rest of the world was losing its mind. Reinventing, exactly. So today he runs the Future Solving Company, advising Fortune 500 executives, and he's got a sharp and sometimes provocative take on what companies are getting wrong and right as they rush to adopt AI and agents. So Brian, it's great to have you here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
The way that I read your work, your core argument is that AI is not a company's strategy. You need a vision for the future that you're trying to create first, and then AI becomes a tool for getting there. And you call this future solving. Most companies have it backward. They start with the technology and then they ask what to do with it. Is that a fair read? And why is it so hard for organizations to flip that?
That is a very fair read. In my role at Microsoft, especially when I was leading AI strategy, I wasn't leading the US strategy in terms of what Microsoft was investing in. I was flying out to meet with Fortune 500 C-suite exec teams to help them develop their AI strategy back in 2019. And so what I found was they were all following the, at the time, playbook, which was start with a problem you want to solve, pick a good use case, start with low-hanging fruit, probably things you would hear at most conferences you go to today. So that's what we tried. And our numbers reflected all the numbers you see to even today, right? 87%, 95%, depending on which source you're looking at, most AI projects fail. And so I set out to say, okay, unlike, many in this space right now where delivering the strategy is when you can then send the invoice, we were being measured on, are they running workloads in Azure that they're going to keep running because it's creating value for them? And so we had to figure it out from a practical perspective. And that's what led to the research and then writing and then ultimately the insights that have found their way into the book.
So you lay this out, you have 5 steps that you want people to follow. And it really starts with, initially, achieving the vision. You're not solving problems, you're solving for the future is really what you're doing. How has that changed, if at all, in the last few years since you wrote the book? And how have agents in particular started to shape that process of envisioning the future and then figuring out the tools to get there?
So what I would say is that it's like if you were a painter and there were a new color, that wouldn't change the way that you think about and envision what you're going to paint. You're envisioning something that will communicate something beautiful, and now there's a new color that you're adding to your palette. And I'd say in the same way from a business perspective, agents, you shouldn't start with, okay, and I like to compare it to if you were doing a remodel on your home, if someone showed up at your door with a saw and said, okay, I have this amazing saw. It's the fastest one in the market today. Let's walk through your home and let's figure out how we're going to make your home better. That's not how we would start a remodel, right? You think, okay, I've hired the wrong contractor, right? But instead saying, well, what do we want to do? Do you want a bigger counter? Do you want a bigger shower? Do you want to add a bonus room? And start with that outcome first, which sounds, of course, so intuitive when you say it, but yet most of the time when we get in a room, one of the things that I've sort of tried to narrow down and distill into something pithy is that use cases are the friend of engineering, but the enemy of strategy. So they're very helpful when you're trying to build something to make sure that it has use. But then when you're in a strategy conversation where you're trying to decide what you should do, starting with the technology and starting with use cases undercuts the real thinking that you need to do to go back to what are our core competencies, the total addressable value that we could create in the market, and what are the ways that now that we have these new, hopefully some literacy on what these new tools can do, are there new ways that we could rethink the ways that we're adding that value that would be commercially viable, that people would pay us for? And starting and anchoring on that first, and then saying, well, what would have to be true for us to be able to introduce that? And working backwards is what I found that the organizations that both through what we were working with directly during my time at Microsoft, but also since in general, when we hear success stories and work backwards, we find, most of the time there was a vision that someone had, a value that they wanted to create. So instead of being AI first, you need to be value first, which, I know a lot of people in this room, we talk about customer value all the time, right? And so it won't sound new, and yet for some reason it is new when you get into that room where you're actually having those conversations. Most of the time you'll see someone pull up and start talking about use cases and skip over starting with vision.
And then building on that, as I read it, one of the fundamental tenets of your approach is that doing good in the world for companies, it can be directly aligned with profits. And you see this new era of automation as an opportunity to accelerate that. Are you seeing that play out yet at all in any of the clients you're working with or any of the companies that you see in the world, that alignment between doing good and doing well?
Right, profitable good, right.
Yes.
So in the book, I introduce a spectrum from, on the one end is greed, which is money at any cost. And the other end is altruism, which is good at any cost. And then the middle is where most people that are just trying to make an honest living and not necessarily in this position where they feel like they can be altruistic or greedy. And so I talked about anything to the right of the middle toward altruism, where you're still turning a profit, you're still self-sustaining, but you're doing something good in the world is profitable good. So I would say in terms of the biggest shifts I've seen in that space is less so from a environmental, especially with the current geopolitical things going on, but I'd say more so in terms of, I put out a thesis a couple months ago about how I think humans will be the interface. So many people are focusing in the last 100 years. 100 years ago, for example, there were 750,000 washerwomen employed in the US. And then that shifted on services in general, that shifted to products when we introduced all these different physical products that could do things in your home. And that the workload also shifted onto the consumer, where instead of paying a lot of people to do all these services, you're doing it all, which at first is convenient, but it starts to stack up. And we have a version of that now with digital, where we're logging in anything you want to do all day, you're logging in and out of so many different systems. And so the solution many are focused on, especially when it comes to AI agents, is, well, let's put another system in there that hopefully will simplify some of that, but we're still putting the AI in front of the person. And what I posited was that actually I think humans can be the interface. That's what we all want when you pick up a call for customer support. You want to hear another person's voice, right? Instead of trying to drive out cost and try to make that AI better and hope that they won't, push zero a million times to try to get to a person, you can actually have a person picking up that first call and have AI be the middle layer, the middleware between that person. So that person needs less training and they can focus on what they're best at, which is taking care of the customer. And so there's a couple companies now, since I put that out there, that one in particular I'm very excited about, that's a Fortune, 25 retailer that is going to go all in on that concept for their customer support and double down on humans as the interface.
Really? What does that mean in terms of their costs and their efficiencies? Because I'm sitting here thinking it feels like the rest of the world is going in a different direction. How are they going to end up better off for that?
Well, they're turning it from a cost center to a profit center, because when you have a person picking up the phone, answering that call that there's going to return, there's some kind of problem, that person can deftly maneuver through that and understand what's really going on, and at a minimum earn loyalty, right? But at a maximum, they might say, and I saw you're also looking at this other thing, and because of the problem here, we could offer you a discount. And then now they're buying more things because of that support call, right? Whereas if it just been an AI agent that they're frustrated, they might churn and not ever come back because they're so frustrated.
It's interesting because one of the core theses of the book is that you want to figure out what humans can do best, judgment, values, and not just mere calculations, right? And I can imagine that part of the challenge would be identifying what humans can do best and what machines and agents can do best. But I would have thought that would have been squarely in the realm of agents in terms of what they could do in the most optimal way.
Well, where they can be very valuable is for like SMB 24/7 support. So if you're a bank, let's say like BECU, I love the fact that I can, update my spending limit on the fly in the app. Like I don't need to call someone for that. So I think it's part of, and like you said in the book, is figuring out what are those points of interface that matter for relationship building versus the ones where they just want a quick and easy fix. And so ironically, like McDonald's, for example, piloted 2 fully autonomous drive-throughs where you didn't interact with a person. And you would think that's a very short transactional experience. They don't care about interfacing with a human there. And yet it turns out that there was massive backlash from customers who were like, even in that 5-minute drive-through experience, I want to speak to a person. I want to see a person's face handing me my food. And that mattered to them. And so they discontinued that program. And so I think we're seeing more and more. And the same thing, the best public case study example for going all in on AI for customer support or for a human interaction is Klarna. For anyone who's not familiar, they said AI can now do all the work that humans can do. They laid off 700 people and replaced them with AI and said AI is going to do all our customer support. There's also a funding round around then, just by the way. But then it turns out, then there was this article that came out about a year later, maybe 8 months later, from Futurism that said, fintech startup, lays off 700 workers and then panics and has engineers and marketing managers picking up the phone while they try to rebuild their customer support organization. So that's the best case study we have of someone very publicly declaring that they went all in that way and eliminated human workers in that space. And that's how it turned out. They're backtracking. So that's not to say, because the potential and that's where I come back to the idea of AI agents being the middleware. When we envision the future of work, it's sort of a very simple, like a lot of times we look at and when I say the total, imagine like a multi-tiered Venn diagram where you have this giant circle, which is a total addressable value that you could create as an organization or a department that people would pay you money for, right? And then within that is a subcircle, which is the value you're already creating, however you're creating it. And then there's this other circle, which is addressable value that could be created by AI and AI agents. And there's a very small overlap. And most organizations and leaders are saying, let's pick up the value we're already doing and see, can we do that faster, better, or cheaper with AI? And to me, that's really missing the opportunity because there's all this other addressable value that could be created based on your core competency and your market footprint and all the great things that you do. When you add in a new form factor, just like Netflix didn't say, like when they didn't say, how do we send DVDs to people faster, better, cheaper, right? They said, wow, there's new form factors available. We can fulfill our core mission and vision of people accessing entertainment everywhere through streaming. And that's how they introduced that, as opposed to finding ways to optimize or increase efficiencies on the DVD business.
You're listening to a special midweek edition of the GeekWire podcast. This is our Agents of Transformation series presented by Accenture, and our guest is Brian Evergreen, author of Autonomous Transformation. We'll be right back. In the book, you write about your first corporate job. You were hired as a data entry contractor, and you taught yourself the system.
Yes, I was.
You taught yourself the system. You automated much of what the team was doing. Obviously, you sort of foreshadowed the rest of your career. And within 6 months, you worked your way into a full-time consulting role, which I assume that was at?
That was here. That was at Accenture. Yeah. So I was on, there's a few, I think there's maybe like 5 people in the room that might remember that. I joined on the staffing team as a contractor. and I learned SharePoint. I taught myself SharePoint workflows because we were using SharePoint for everything, and I thought there has to be a way to do some of these things more easily. And then I got to the point where the leader of the I'm not going to name her because I don't want to put her on blast, but the leader of the team at the time said, okay, now, like she'd said, I don't want you to leave until you get to a certain point of proficiency on this system. So we created this little helper, and his name was Chauncey. And so he would automatically send different emails, and he would sign his emails as Chauncey. And then I rolled off and pretty soon joined for Andy Tay's, who I understand was a former guest on the podcast. So joined Andy Tay's team, and the rest was history.
So what did that experience of basically figuring out automation, finding a new role for yourself, what did that teach you about how organizations actually work? And how has that informed your direction in your career and the work that you're doing today?
I'd say the biggest thing that it might have informed is just high agency, right? And so a lot of times we look from a systemic perspective at our organization, our department, and we say, okay, how do we make things slightly better? Or what am I being tasked with doing, and how do I achieve that scorecard? And so I, at the time, felt like there's an opportunity that we could be doing this stuff maybe more efficiently, and it could be more valuable for everybody involved. And so then I didn't really ask for permission because it wasn't going to hurt anything for me to go learn a new skill, right? And so then I just went out and learned that, and I did it again in a different part of while I was at Accenture, of learning JavaScript and building and deploying an app that ended up turning into a commercial offering I learned, which is exciting. But
you just learned that tonight?
I don't know if I'm allowed to quote where it got to, but yeah. I'd heard it might have been. There was plans to do it before I left, but yeah, I learned that it landed, that there were deals landed around it, which is exciting. But yeah, so I'd say high agency was probably the biggest thing. And I think that's one of the things that I teach leaders a lot today, everywhere from NASA to MasterCard to Microsoft and et cetera, which is we talk a lot about the future of work. We talk a lot about where things are headed from a reactive perspective of like, well, where do we think the trends are looking, and where might things be headed? How do we be future-proof, future-ready? That's all reactive. That's all defensive. So I say, hey, let's flip that on its head. What future do you like? Because you're resigning when you talk about it that way. You're resigning and saying, I hope that whoever builds that future, that there's a good place for me and my organization in it. So instead, I say, no, we're at a moment in time where we all know there's this inflection point where we need to make some strategic decisions. So what is the future that you want to be in? What future of work do you want to build for yourself and your organization or your department? And then what would have to be true for you to be able to do that? That's the starting point of future solving.
An audience member asked Brian whether there's a point where the cost of AI exceeds the cost of a human worker doing similar work.
It's a great question. A job is an accountability for an outcome. And so a lot of times we end up talking about job replacement via AI when AI can't hold accountability for an outcome and for the quality of that outcome. And so I prefer, in the conversations I've been having, the research I've done is about decoupling and trying to help people see how you should decouple tasks from jobs, because a job is an accountability for a specific outcome. So as I think AI becomes more abundant, as it becomes more performant, we'll move into a space where I think the same or even greater number of people, especially if you have a strong vision and you're creating a new growth category like Netflix did with streaming, that created jobs. So I think that the idea of saying we've had this paradigm since the 1970s with the rise of shareholder primacy of like someone coming in, the invention's been made, the market's been set, the footprint is there, and now we're going to squeeze as much margin out and pay out to the shareholders, right? And that's been the paradigm that a lot of leaders have operated in. And AI is shaking that because they're looking and saying, why isn't this working? It worked well. You didn't need a vision at all to modernize an app and get a bunch of value. You didn't need a vision at all to go from an analog process to a digital process and be 15 times more efficient, pay out your shareholders. But with AI, it doesn't work the same way because you have to rethink the whole thing. It doesn't just fit neatly the way that a SharePoint workflow might have. And so that's what I'd say is I would move away from trying to do a cost-to-cost analysis between people and machines, and instead think through from a job perspective, what are the cost of tasks, and are there tasks that are high value but repetitive that we can use where it's not so repetitive that we can script it like with automation, but where we do need something with AI, but we're willing to accept some degree of variability and hallucinations. That's the one thing I always share when people talk about AI is say like, okay, you want to replace, XYZ team with AI. Today, if you had an interview with a junior associate and they, everything's looking great, right? And then at the end, you're like, hey, listen, like, when can you start? You're excited. And they said, oh, I think, I can start ASAP, but I do need to let you know one thing. I hallucinate, like, 30 to 70% of the time, Like, you would be like...
70, come on.
Is Grok a part of this? So you wouldn't hire that person, right? So I think that's where I think from a hiring and people versus machines perspective, I think like a job is I'll say it one last time, job is an accountability for an outcome. So if you give someone an accountability for that outcome and you say, go to town with how you're going to get it done, but you're the person I'm looking at when that thing goes south, then it can use AI, absolutely. But they're still holding that accountability. I hope that answers your question.
Is there one final message that you would want this audience to walk away with here in the room and then as a proxy for the business and technology leaders who are listening to the show, to the GeekWire podcast? How should they be thinking about this current moment, especially with agents coming on board, creating the kind of profitable good that you're talking about long-term for themselves and for their organizations and for the world?
The first thing I'd say is that don't get distracted by the technology. Not to say that you don't learn about the technology, but it's easy to think that, okay, agentifying our workflow means we've succeeded. But that's actually not true. If it's the same outcome, that means you've reformed, you made it a little better. Okay, cool. But is that so valuable? No, not necessarily. So I'd say the first thing is having a vision for, and the word vision might feel lofty. So it could be an ambition, a goal. Have something that you want to do that's different than what you're doing today. And if you don't have, and vision is the only thing, especially if you want an AI initiative to succeed, I found that vision is the only force with enough momentum to overcome organizational inertia. So having a vision in the first place, and then working backwards to say what would have to be true, and leading the people in your organization toward that vision is critical, and making sure that because a shared vision for the future is the foundation of trust. And so if you think about from a political perspective, the people we vote for are the people we believe are going to create a version of the future that we want to live in, right? The people that we buy with, like look what just happened with Anthropic and ChatGPT, are the people that we think we're aligned with from a values perspective and are going to create that future. So having that vision and articulating it clearly and then aligning your resources to that. And if you don't have a vision, then you can't have a strategy, because a strategy is a path from here to there. And so if there's no there defined, then there's no strategy. And if there's no strategy, you can't make a strategic decision, because something being strategic is how well it aligns to the strategy. So we get caught up in these cycles of trying to feel smart, trying to feel like we're being productive, trying to get an X number of hours worked out. But I think that this era more than ever, with all the amazing technologies that exist today, we need to be doubling down on thinking through from a value perspective. If we succeed at what we're trying to do right now, what new value would we have created? And if you start with that question and every conversation that you're having, you're going to probably make some changes from the way that things are going today.
Brian Evergreen, the book is Autonomous Transformation, Creating a More Human Future in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. Thank you very much for being here with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Brian Evergreen's book is Autonomous Transformation, and you can find his latest writing and his future solving podcast at brianevergreen.com. This has been a special edition of the GeekWire podcast, part of our Agents of Transformation series, presented by Accenture. You can find more in the series at geekwire.com/agents. Curt Milton edited the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back this weekend with our regular weekly news roundup.